Hello, and welcome to Bloomsday Montreal 2020 online. Today is a very special day. This is our academic panel. Now, in previous years, the academic panel has taken place in the McKenty Reading Room on the 10th floor of the Hall building of Concordia University on de Maisonneuve Boulevard in downtown Montreal. Today, because of COVID-19, this distinguished academic panel has gathered from 3 continents. So it really is a very special day. This is our 9th year, and I was just thinking if we had all those numbers for Joyce to conjure with, he would create a very, very interesting puzzle. So I wanted to talk about the first thing to do is to introduce you to our webmaster, my dear friend, Edmund Nash, who is in charge of making sure everything goes smoothly and also in charge of troubleshooting should things not go so smoothly. Everything is dependent on the technology. And as I was just saying, I've got a chainsaw operating in my back lane. So who knows what can happen anywhere between Europe, South America, and North America. So Edmund, here you are. Do you want to say a few words?
Hello, and just to let everyone know that there's an icon at the bottom that says Q&A. You can use that to ask questions, which will be answered at the end of the presentations. Thanks, Kathleen.
Great. Thank you, Edmund. Now, next, it's my pleasure to introduce Geraldine Jimenez, who is going to be the moderator for today's event. Geraldine Jimenez obtained a Master of Fine Arts degree, piano, at the Tchaikovsky National Music Academy of the Ukraine. She participated in several international Bach festivals, and she now performs Bach almost every day on Facebook. She also trained as a lyric singer and has performed with orchestras in her native Caracas, Venezuela, and elsewhere. She's an accomplished accompanist, and since she arrived in Montreal, in addition to doing various things at concerts, she became a star of the Metro. We have performers who work in the Metro. And and of course, there's a kind of, you know, it's a bit of a culture of these wonderful entertainers who perform in the Metro. And she was selected as a Metro star. So you are dealing with a star here. Not only is she an incredibly accomplished artist, she is also a dedicated Joycean. So much so that she has been involved with numerous online reading groups, whether it's Facebook or Twitter. I'm afraid I'm not really into all of this technology online, so it's a little bit of a mystery to me. But she has run, or she's participated in and organized online reading groups for War and Peace and Anna Karenina, because of course she speaks fluent Russian. And she's very, very involved with a reading group that's operating now on Finnegan's Wake. And in the past, she has had 2 separate Ulysses reading groups. Of course, she reads it in the original, and they are, the discussion groups are in Spanish. So it's just this international flood of information that she is responsible for creating. And we are delighted to have her here to moderate our international panel of experts on Joyce. Geraldine, over to you.
Good morning. Welcome to Bloomsday Montreal 2020 academic panel. We're going to have 4 really interesting guests who are Marcelo Zavaloi, Peter Stockland, Kayla Fanning, and John McCoy. The way this is going to work is that they're going to make their presentations one after the other. You can leave your questions, as Esmond said, in questions and answer here in Zoom. And after all the presentations, we're going to ask your questions that we're going to read over there. So we want to start our academic panel with Marcelo Zavaloy, who is joining us from Bahía Blanca in Argentina. Marcelo Zavaloy is one of the Ulysses translators to Spanish, but he is the only one who has translated Finnegan's Wake to Spanish in its entirety, because Finnegan's Wake was translated only, there were attempts to translate it, but it was mostly chapter 8, Ana Livia Plurabel. And there's a translation of the whole first chapter. But Marcelo has the only edition in Spanish of the complete Finnegan's Wake. So he lives in Bahía Blanca since all his life. He has 2 daughters and 4 sons, and he's been married to Marcela for 40 years. So he's gonna tell us the story how he came to Joyce from being a former IT, and how he developed these acclaimed translations. That's gonna be his presentation. Welcome, Marcelo.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Geraldine. Can you hear me clearly? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation for a start. Just for not to be taken as a talkative man, which I would hate that, yeah, I beg you please to stop me when it's time to stop. I think I'm around or near 10, 15 minutes. Is it so?
Yeah.
Well, so it's your job to stop me when enough becomes enough. So I'll try to make it a long story short. So as you said, my name is Marcelo Zavaloy. I live in Bahía Blanca, a rather mid-sized city in the province of Buenos Aires, in the middle of the Pampa region in Argentina. That's my background. I was born here and lived up to now here, and I have no plans to move on. So the first thing I need to say to make it clear that I am not a scholar, so I haven't got the responsibility that all of you have. I am not a professional translator, even though I have translated many things in my life, mostly for pleasure of doing so, many short stories, and I've translated some sports manuals, because one of my interests and one of my passions is the game of rugby. And that's why I got used to this thing of translated things in the old days when translations into Spanish were not available. So from there, I got the virus of translating things and short stories, which I read and I wanted to share in the old times again, when it wasn't easy to get some books or some particular texts. I got the poor English I have, learning at school since I was 5 years old, and I never stopped reading. I had an interest in short stories, in novels, so mostly half of the things I read in my life, I read them in English. So that's how I started my way to meeting James Joyce. And I remember I read one story with counterparts in Dubliners. I read that at school when I could have been a 12-year-old boy. And then I read it again 20 years later in a collection of 50 best American short stories. Even though it wasn't an American writer, James Joyce was included in that collection that published Martha Foley. And I found, again, these counterparts. Short story was beautiful. And I had so many writers have said that Joyce was difficult to read, that he was impossible to get through, that it was dark, that it was boring, and etc., etc. And one of our greatest writers, Jorge Luis Borges, was particularly fond of Joyce, even though he sort of criticized him for this same reason, for being too or far too obscure. Well, so those mentions about Joyce sort of made me interested in seeing why he was considered so dark and so difficult to read. And I wanted to read the draft book, Ulysses. I started reading first Dubliners, which was a pleasure. Then I stepped to the portrait of the artist. So it was sort of difficult, but not so much. And that's why I wanted to see by my own, which was the difficulty of reading Ulysses. So I decided that, and one day my wife was going to the US to see one of a brother who was living there, and I asked her to please to get me a copy of Ulysses. I wanted to read it in English. There, of course, there were available Spanish translations, but I didn't want to put on the translators the blame of not understanding the book. It would have been very simple to say, this must be a bad translation, and that's why I don't understand. I cannot understand this book. So not to put the blame on, to blame the translator for that. That's why I decided to read it in English, and that's how I started. And that was 2004, my first reading. It took me a whole year to sort of navigate the book without no idea of what I was going to find. I knew about the long day story, and that's all I knew. I didn't have the prejudge of prejuicios. Is that correct, Geraldina? Prejuicio? Is that the word?
Prejudice.
Prejudice. That's sorry. So the many things I didn't understand, of course, I just didn't care about that. I just went over and kept on going and going, and it was a huge pleasure, even considering that it was hard to go through some dark passages. Well, then after 1 year, I decided to restart, but this time I provided myself with lots of bibliography. Of course, the first book I bought on the internet was a Gifford's book, Ulysses Annotated. So that second reading was a new one. It was a new book. I was discovering a new book, and much more appealing, because I could read many things I didn't understand. I could clarify them on that second reading. So at some stage, I was so involved with that. I have to say that I was working to earn my living, so I could read in my spare time. The free time that work and rugby left me. So, but any free minute I had, I used to sit down and read. And that's why I wanted to demonstrate to my family that I wasn't absolutely mad. And for the sake of communicating the reason why I was so involved in the book was I wanted to read to my wife a small paragraph, and that paragraph in the middle of Ithaca, where Bloom compares the similarities between Women and the Moon. And my first option was to read it right from the English in a loud voice, and at the same time, while reading, making the interpretation, which was not good enough. It took off all the beauty of the text in the stumbling with words. So I said, well, just wait a moment, I will go and sit down for a few minutes and translate this paragraph for you. I could have taken any Spanish version and read it, but that was not the option. I wanted to translate that paragraph myself. And I did that, but instead of taking me, say, 10, 15 minutes, it took me the whole day to translate 10, 15 lines. And then I was so pleased with the result. I thought it was marvelous to get it exact what I thought it was exactly what the author wanted to say. And my wife, she enjoyed the paragraph. It's very, very beautiful. And that was the start of it. And I then followed with another paragraph and another one and another one. And I went right to the end of the Untitled Chapter. And then I started with Molly Bloom's monologue. I couldn't stop translating because it made me absolutely happy. It filled my day. And apart from that, I discovered that way that it was the best way of reading. Of course, you cannot translate every book you read, but if you did, you would understand much more what you are reading. Because even though we are all serious readers, we sometimes get tired or we assume things that are not. So I finished the episode 18, and then I went to the first one and the second one. So in the term of that process of translating started in 2005, and I ended in 2009. So it took me almost 4 years. And it was by the 16th of June, of course, that I key in the last yes. I was delaying the last yes to make it a memorable occasion, and I wrote the final yes. I would yes on the 16th of June. Nobody knew that. It was only me and my wife who knew that I was making such a stupid thing as delaying a couple of months, a few words for making it coincide with Bloomsday. And then I became sort of depressed. I wanted to find something that could occupy my spare time, and I couldn't find nothing. So I started reading and Finnegan's Wake, and well, that's another story. But just tell me, please, Geraldine, how are we with the time? I can't hear you.
Okay, you can go on. You
Okay.
can talk about the Finnegan's Wake.
Okay, I won't talk about Finnegan's Wake because that would be a mess. So I can answer questions later, but I want to say what I did. Once again, my wife told me, why don't you try to get your translation published? And I said, I never thought about that, but once it was done, it was a crime not to show it. So I sent emails to most of the local publishing houses here and in Spain and Mexico, I think, and nobody replied. But I received one one answer from a lady in Spain who told me her name is Laure Mer Dauvignier, obviously a French lady who's a literary agent in Spain. And she mentioned, she suggested me to contact one publishing house here in Buenos Aires. She said, why don't you contact El Cuenco de Plata? They publish translations. And I did so. I sent an email. For a couple of months, I didn't receive any answer. So I sort of forgot about the thing. I thought it was impossible to do it. And by the end of 2009, or the first, could have been February 2010, and I received a phone call by it was a man, his name is Edgardo Russo, who said, you sent us an email with a chapter of Ulysses. Said, are you Mr. Marcelo Zavalor? Yes, I am, and I sent you that email. I said, well, sorry for the delay in answering, but we thought that somebody was playing a joke on us, pulling our leg. I said, no, I was not. I'm serious, I was not pulling your leg. Yeah, we realized that because we make consultations with another Georgian people here, and they said it was not a joke. And in case it was a joke, it was a very good joke indeed. So after that, he invited me to sign a contract, and we started reading and making revisions online for almost 4 years. With Edgardo Russo, with Eugenio Conches, a young professor of literature in Santa Rosa, La Pampa, here in Argentina. Eugenio took care of the notes. He revised every note, every single page of the text with absolute detail. And with Edgardo Russo, who was the editor and owner, he passed away in 2015. We worked for 4 full years in that. And at the same time, while I was making these revisions of Ulysses, as I needed desperately something difficult to do, is that I got involved in the Finnegan's Wake thing. But I want to speak about a few weird things that happened in the process of this translation. The first thing happened when I went with my wife, Marcela, and one of my sons to the Rugby World Cup in Paris in 2007. We were taking our travel agency. We were taking a group of young rugby players to watch the Rugby World Cup 2007. And we went to the opening match, which was it was a huge victory for the Argentinian side. We won the opening game. The day after that, it was couple of days after, it was my birthday, the 10th of September, and we were on a bus traveling, making the typical city tour of Paris, and my wife and my son gave me a parcel. I opened it. They said, happy birthday, this is for you. And they offered me, it was a book. It was Ulysses, a very, very old yellow book, Ulysses, translated into French. And I said to myself, why do I need to read it in French? It's difficult enough, the book, for me to read it in English. And but I was studying French. I was I had a good level of French. I opened that book and I could see in the first page that it was translated by Mr. Auguste Morel and Monsieur Valéry Darbon avec la participation de l'auteur. L'auteur, ça veut dire Monsieur Joyce. Ce n'est pas possible. It was a version. It was Mr. Joyce himself that supervised that translation. So I said, this will clarify a lot of things that are still unclear. So I started reading it in French. And it was a huge support of my translations, because everything, just anything that I couldn't understand, even though I had all these books, support books, textbooks about Joyce, that text in French, I trusted, because it was James Joyce who was verifying, revising this French translation. So it helped a lot. So that was a very miracle thing that I got to know the French version, which happened to be the first translation into any other language. And the first thing was that. The second one, it was in 2008. I was for a few days in sort of holidays with my wife in Montermoso in winter. Montermoso is a small town, a seaside town, empty, of course, as could be any seaside town. Well, I was translating chapter 6, Hates, and was in the part of when Mr. Bloom thinks about the death of Padre Dignam and how the heart works, and it's an old rusty machine that stops. And I was translating that same paragraph, and at that same moment I had a heart attack, and which I obviously survived. Well, there are many stories that happened during this translation. I don't want to bore you, and I will stop my presentation here, and if there's any question, we can go on from there. So thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you, Marcelo. So for those who are just connecting this moment, we are in the academic panel of Bloomsday Montreal 2020. And our next guest is joining us from Montreal, is Kayla Fanning, who is a master's student in the English department at Concordia University. She's interested in contemporary Irish literature, and she's writing her research project on Louise O'Neill as a case study of how questions of pace manifest in contemporary Irish novels. Because of this work that she's doing on Louise O'Neill, she can deepen in topics that interest her, as eating disorders, gender politics, rape culture, and Irish mythology. So last year, she already presented herself at the Canadian Association of Irish Studies, and she's looking forward to more conference opportunities. So now Kayla is gonna talk us about a critique of journalism and of the Irish revival in Aulus in the Ulysses. Welcome, Kayla.
Thank you, Geraldina. I'm very happy to be here today presenting for my second time on the Bloomsday conference. I did so last year also on Nora, and this year I am, well, first of all, I'm happy to do this on this new platform, and I'll be reading an essay that is loosely based off an essay I wrote in 2016. So I reread it and just decided I would have to rewrite everything. So anyways, I'll get right into it. I have a presentation on PowerPoint I'd like to share with everyone. All right. So James Joyce's Ulysses chapter Aeolus, in being associated by name with the Homeric episode on ill winds, engages with issues of cyclical movement. According to John Greenway, in Homer's Odyssey, Ulysses ventures to Aeolia and speaks to Aeolus, the god of the winds, who gives Ulysses a bag of ill winds, which, if freed, would hinder his ability to return home to Ithaca. On Ulysses' journey back home, his crew members open the bag while Ulysses is occupied in hopes of discovering abundant treasure. Instead, the ill winds are released and they are blown back to Aeolia. With regards to Aeolus, the Ulysses chapter, I would like to highlight two aspects. First, the fragmentation afforded by the headlines that deteriorate in effectiveness throughout the chapter highlights the inadequacy of journalism in meaningful engagements with society. This critique of journalism is reminiscent of Samuel Johnson's Romantic era concerns with the deterioration of literature engendered by the printing press. Secondly, and simultaneously, the incorporation of revivalist references paired with the wasted, stagnant breath motif and with the cyclic nature of the Homeric intimation reveals a staunch critique of the revivalist trope of returning to the past. In Aeolus, a critique of journalism is made through its association with the inefficient and deteriorating subtitles, which stipulate that journalism creates unrelated associations between itself and reality. The fractured narration offered by the use of headings creates more confusion than clarity for the reader. These headlines resemble those of a newspaper, and according to Hayward Ehrlich, act as a second narrator, creating unrelated associations between the headlines and the narrative. Often, the headlines reiterate the first few words of the first sentence of the paragraph, or vaguely hint to a plot point, like how the subtitle, "A Distant Voice," refers to the phone call answered by the professor. Not only do the headlines fragment the narrative and offer little to no context, they deteriorate as the chapter progresses as well. Earlier in the chapter, the subtitle, "The House of Keys," at least highlights the significance of Bloom's ad, although the paragraph following it offers no certainty as to whether the ad will be published. Later headlines such as "What" and likewise "Where" offer little to no guidance and frame small paragraphs of sometimes one or two sentences. In addition to the impracticality of the headlines, the men in the Evening Telegraph office are idle and futile characters, as they speak to one another throughout the episode without saying anything of importance. For example, amidst a conversation with the editor and the professor, J.J. O'Malloy says, "Bush KC, for example." "Bush," the editor says. "Well, yes, Bush, yes, he has a strain for it in his blood." "Kendall Bush, or I mean Seymour Bush. He would have been on the bench long ago," the professor said. "Only 4, but no matter." The repetition of Bush causes uncertainty in the reader, as they are left unsure of which Bush is being spoken of, and are left to question whether his name, repeated 5 times, is of any importance at all. Before coming to the realization that none of their conversations are meaningful, the reader is encouraged by the confusion to reread the entire paragraphs in search of clarity. O'Malloy is often rhetorically cut off by the editor in a way that mirrors how the newspaper headlines fragment the narrative. Similarly to how this example ends inconclusively and in confession of its irrelevance, as the professor says, "But no matter." O'Malloy never finishes his story, Stephen is not published in the paper, and Bloom's ad is rejected. The chapter offers no forward movement and even propels the reader and the main character backwards in search of meaning and clarity. A connection is made between the characters, the inanimate objects, and the literary structure of the chapter, as they all take on life and demand to be heard, yet fail to say anything meaningful. For instance, according to Scarlett Baron, The choppiness of the headlines creates a narrative pace that is reminiscent of an inhale and exhale of breath that increases in rapidity, which strengthens Karen R. Lawrence's statement that the headlines take on a life of their own by mimicking breath and emphasizing themes of misdirecting cycles. The sounds made by the machines are repetitive and rhythmic, similar to breathing. The sound made by the printing press is characterized as a form of circulation, quote, thumping, a thumping, unquote, and as a slit. The use of the word circulation reminds the reader of the connection being made to the body, and the repetition of thumping adds rhythm and life to this association. Similar to a heartbeat, the chapter incorporates speech and movement, yet offers it no changing power. It is stuck in a cyclical pattern. The use of repetition here invokes a rhythm, a sound that can be considered a voice, where it is, quote, almost human the way it slipped to call its attention, doing its level best to speak. According to Ehrlich, if vibrations and sounds can be considered a type of speech similar to Morse code, then the printing press assumes a life of its own with an independent voice. The animation of the printing press, paired with the chapter's overall tone of stagnant despair, and by depicting machines as something that would, quote, smash a man to atoms if they got him caught, unquote, this renders the printing press monstrous and almost threatening. In considering how the headlines and the pressmen are not vehicles of change, Aeolus can be viewed as a critique of journalism reminiscent of Johnson's fears, his fear of intellectual degeneration engendered by the accessibility of the printing press. Johnson proclaimed that the Romantic era was the age of authors, as, quote, there never was a time in which men of all degrees and abilities were posting with ardor so general to the press, unquote, which he characterizes as a malady in need of cure. That is, the age of author is a malady. Kindred to how Johnson related newspaper articles to the deprivation of taste and the corruption of language, Len Platt states that Joyce described journalism as the degenerating medium and as, quote, dead noise, unquote. And this sentiment is furthered in Aeolus as, in the press room, Professor McHugh asserts that, quote, success for us is the death of the intellect and of the imagination, unquote. Similarly to how the newspaper is framed in Aeolus, Johnson describes the language of most newspaper articles as no more than a transposition of common sentiment and a repetition of common phrases. This aligns with the chapter's stagnant breath motif and cyclical content. So, in examining the similarities between Johnson's and Joyce's perspectives on journalism, the printing press in Aeolus embodies a sinister quality, and the pressmen personify a degenerative stasis. In addition to the stasis of the journalism mode, the combination of allusions to the Irish revival movement and of the stagnant breath pattern afforded by the Homeric reference reveals a critique of revivalist motifs of idealizing the pastoral and of returning to the past. Joyce incorporates common revival sentiments and phrases such as more Irish than the Irish, which refers to the Anglo-Irish class that spearheaded the revivalist movement. These phrases are used as a means of demonstrating their inefficacy. According to Platt, the bag of ill winds can be associated with tired, useless repetition and the blowing of hot air. The underlying themes in this episode consist more precisely of disappointment and useless cycles. In considering the theme of blowing hot air, the sentence, quote, if we but climb the serried mountain peaks, is described by Professor McHugh as an inflated windbag. which in other words means that nature elegies are a tired form. This sentiment is strengthened by the fact that the passage, evocative of revivalist feeling, quote, the panorama of Ireland unmatched for very beauty, of bosky grove, and luscious pastureland of vernal green, steeped in the transcendent, translucent glow of our mild, mysterious Irish twilight, is overloaded with redundant language. Even the endnote highlights how bosky, which means covered with bushes, is expendable when used to describe a grove. Professor McHugh lectures on the similarities between the Roman Empire and Great Britain and professes, quote, Greek to be the language of the mind, unquote. Yet these reiterations of the past in the context of the present do not supply any forward movement to the narrative. Simultaneously, the editor recalls the best pressmen of the past, and McHugh furthers this lamentation by noting that the finest display of oratory he had ever heard was on an essay, quote, advocating the revival of the Irish tongue, unquote. In Aeolus, the idealization of past forms of communication keep the characters in a cycle where anything new is inevitably disappointing. Directly following these recollections, the imagery of Professor McHugh steadying his spectacles to a new focus can be interpreted as a critique of literary revival idealizations and as an encouragement to focus on new innovative forms of writing. As such, in a way reminiscent of Johnson's commentary on journalism, in Aeolus, speech is proven stagnant and lacking. Scarlett Baron furthers this notion by communicating that speech loses its power to generate change by being associated with tired, repetitive rhetorical devices and revivalist statements. To conclude, the fragmentation afforded by the headlines that deteriorated in effectiveness throughout the chapter and the futility of the pressman calls attention to how journalistic modes of writing lack the ability to engage with society in a meaningful way. Joyce's critique of journalism shares various similarities with Johnson's critique of the age of authors era, in that they are both concerned with the deterioration of literature. The transposition of revivalist common sentiment paired with the inability of speech to induce change reveals a firm critique of the revivalist trope of returning to the past and of idealizing the pastoral. Instead, the revivalist references in the Aeolus encourage an endorsement of new and innovative styles of writing. Thank you. Looking forward to answering any questions at the end.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. That was really interesting. For those who are connecting at this point, we are in Bloomsday Montreal 2020 academic panel. You can answer your questions, you can leave your questions in the question and answer section of Zoom, and we're gonna read them and ask them to the panelists at the end of all 4 presentations. We are in the middle of our presentations, and our next guest from Montreal is Peter Stockland, who has worked for 4 decades as a writer and editor for Canadian newspapers and magazines, including time as editor-in-chief of the Montreal Gazette. He expects to complete a certificate in Irish Studies at Concordia this fall and pursue graduate work in Irish history. He was in Belfast last year for 5 weeks as part of the Queen's University Belfast Irish Studies summer program. And he spoke on Ulysses by ear, about learning Ulysses not by reading, but by listening. Today, he brings this really interesting subject about 2 stories from Dubliners. So his presentation is going to be about the demonic in Araby and the dead. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. I guess I would just start by saying that I came to Joyce from a writing perspective, when I was just very young. I was presented with Joyce before I was presented with him as literature, as a model for learning how to become a fiction writer, and ultimately learning how to make language work. And so I tend to look at Joyce from the perspective of how does he do that, rather than what he's doing. And so I don't really consider myself, I'm a student of Joyce. I would not elevate myself to a scholar of Joyce, much less certainly an expert. But I have had a lifelong fascination with how it is that Joyce does what he does. And one of the things that I've had for a very, very long time is this intuition about Araby and the dead forming a kind of artistic completion in Dubliners. And I've tried various ways of sort of figuring that out, because obviously you have to be very careful about intentionality and causality in what a writer is doing. It's, you know, fallacious in many ways to just say, well, he did this because he meant to do that. That's not really how stories very often emerge, even in a writer with the intentionality and the deliberateness of Joyce. It certainly would have been tidier if Joyce had made Araby and the Dead the first and last story of Dubliners, rather than Araby being the third story. It would have been a much nicer, sort of neater, tidier package. But in fact, that's not the case. But one of the explanations I came across to help me get a better grasp of that intuition I've always felt between Araby and the Dead. There was an essay in 2013 by an American academic who I believe is actually a Dickens scholar, but he wrote a long essay on Araby and the writings of Joyce, and Harry Stone. And he had a wonderful phrase. He said that part of it is that Joyce was always meeting himself in ways which must have at times been beyond his own conscious ordinance, his own awareness. And the pages of Araby are witness to that fact. And I think that's true, not just in terms of themes or images or even set scenes that we might examine, but as Stone says, as part of the work of forging the consciousness of his race, that's set out, for example, in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And Stone is emphatic enough to say that Araby is a portrait of the artist as a young boy. So the question for me then becomes, how does that kind of Joycean consciousness manifest itself, bridge itself in two stories from a first collection that are set in the same city at the same time, among not radically different classes of Dubliners, but which are so radically different in themselves as stories, well beyond one being a relatively short, and obviously The Dead is quite a long story, one involving a sexually fevered boy on the edge of adolescence, and the other a man entering middle age in what appears to be a time of crisis in his own life and in a foundering marriage. And I've wondered about that for a very long time. And wouldn't you know it, I found a kind of bracket for it, if not actually a full frame, in a notebook that I found in a bag that I hadn't used for a long time. And I started flipping through the pages, and I bought the notebook at the Joyce Center in Dublin when I was there on a visit. And I happened to have it in my pocket at a mass that I was at St. Teresa's Carmelite Church in Clarendon Street in Dublin. And I started scratching down quotes from, I'm a journalist, I can't help taking quotes, taking notes and making quotes. So I started scratching down quotes from the priest's homily. And as I was flipping through the notebook, this little black notebook, I don't know if you can see it there, there's James in the corner. And of course, my note was upside down and in the back of the book, because that's where the book opened up to. But there's two quotes that really caught my eye and seemed to me applicable to that connection between Araby and the Dead. He began his homily by saying, the one who needs change the most is the one least likely to hear it. And he ended the homily, my note showed me, by saying, "Let us catch ourselves out and change, not change because another has caught us out." So to me, as I was thinking about this, the brackets of those sentences contain the idea or the ideal of epiphany or revelation, particularly the moment of revealing oneself to oneself. Both Araby and the Dead are obviously epiphany stories. The Dead, of course, takes place on Epiphany on January 6th, the day in the Western Christian calendar that marks the Magi bringing the gifts from the East to Bethlehem. To the extent that we nowadays are even aware of Epiphany anymore, the most common association is with the star that guided the Magi. I think less remembered from Matthew's Gospel is the dream that the Magi shared that leads them to the return to their own country by another road. So there's the star that's the external light and darkness, in darkness, and there's the internal power of the dream that obliges the change. If we look at Araby, we're made witnesses to a festival of sensory externalities that provoke a riot of romantic and sexual tension. There's heat, there's light, there's smell, there's sound. Mannion's sister, the love obsession of the young male character in Araby, becomes at one point a soft rope of hair in her role as the signal bell calling her brother in from play. And above all, we're treated in Araby to this oscillating explosion of light and shadow. By my count, and others may correct me, but my count, the first 3 paragraphs of Araby contain 18 references. 3 paragraphs contain 18 references to light, to dark, to color, to shadow. They oscillate from the short days of winter when dusk fell before we had well eaten our dinners, to bodies that glow from the sting of the cold air in the ever-changing violet of the sky. And of course, there's that famous moment in the story when Mannion's sister is defined by the light from the half-open door of her house and the stair upon which she stands. Perhaps most compellingly, the word blind is used in that same introductory frame of Araby 4 times within just a little bit over those 3 paragraphs, including as the parenthetic 5th word in the famous opening sentence, North Richmond Street being blind. And then it's repeated with an underscoring of physical and emotional emptiness in the 10th word of the 2nd sentence, to situate the 2-story uninhabited house at the blind end of North Richmond Street that is surrounded by the other houses with their brown, imperturbable faces. Then just a few lines later on, a couple of paragraphs, blind takes on another meaning to become something to be hidden behind, and paradoxically enable voyeurism. In the lines from that paragraph, every morning I lay on the floor in the front parlor watching her, that is Mannion's sister, front door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash, so I could not be seen. In all this sensory back and forth and going on, Dublin's sounds are actually reduced in the narrator's mind to a single sensation of life, which actually finds its expression in the name of the young woman, whose name we don't even know. We only know her by relation to her, the unnamed young boy's friend, as Mannion's sister. But in contrast to that single sensation of life that is sound, the story is suffused with variations of darkness and light. Dark, rainy evenings, distant lamps, gleaming window light, and the light from the lamp that catches the white curve of Mannion's sister's neck and lights up her hand, falls over one side of her dress and catches the white border suggestively of her petticoat. Dublin's streets glare with gas, as the boy makes his way to the Araby fair, where he intends to buy a gift, not unlike the Magi bringing gifts, and bring it back to Mannion's sister. And he's made aware of how late he is on that trip to Araby by the lighted dial of a clock that tells him he has but minutes to complete his erotically propelled mission. There's this suffusion of light that just permeates this whole mission to go to Araby, to go to this fair and bring back the gift. Of course, the mission ends in humiliating failure. The ersatz cheap Araby bazaar, it's a fake, it's a simulacrum of Easternness, is almost already closed. It's already largely shrouded in darkness. And that darkness will become complete as he, hearing, and quotes, a voice call from one end of the hall that the light was out, will gaze up into, but more see either within the darkness itself or somehow mirroring back from its blind blackness his own image as a creature of vanity, burning with anguish and anger. The effect of this constant shifting between shadow and light, this final gaze into utter darkness as a voice remarks the extinguishing of the light, and the young boy's bitter accusation against himself, is the creation of a kind of what I call ontological chiaroscuro, in which being itself is ultimately swallowed up by the extinction of light. That's pointed to by the narrator's use, as I mentioned, of the word creature in self-reference or self-recognition of himself. I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity, and my eyes burned with anguish and anger. But it's also there, in a sense, in Joyce pulling the blind down to within an inch of the sill, so that we cannot see that the voice speaking is not just that of a humiliated, self-deluded young boy, but of the adult man who is actually telling the story of Araby. That hidden man is the hidden voice in the darkness calling to the boy, and obviously to us as readers. The story ends, and this is what I think first appealed to me so much as a writer as from a literary perspective. The story ends with a kind of blackout curtain fall before the boy becomes the artist as a young man. And we are left with no illumination as to whether the man who grew from that boy ever understood anything other than what he learned from the swallowing darkness. I would argue we are perfectly justified in inferring that his epiphany was a kind of anti-epiphany. Given that he's retailing the tale so much later in his life, it's credible to see him as one of those who, in the homilist's word that I heard at St. Teresa's Carmelite Church in Clarendon Street, Dublin, needs the change most, but is the one least likely to hear it. So, enter the dead. One of the things that always surprises me about the dead is how little light it contains, at least initially, not only in contrast with Araby, but from its own flatness in a house where an epiphany party is underway. There's singing, there's dancing, drinks are served, feasting appropriate to the Epiphany feast ensues. But if we pay close attention to where the radiation for all this is coming from, we get the sense that if Blazes Boylan himself rushed in from Ulysses, he'd be doused with a dump of snow on the porch of the house where the dead unfolds. In fact, in our introduction to the main character, Gabriel Conroy, it comes as he is calling out from the dark, wearing a light fringe of snow, like a cape on the shoulders of his overcoat, and like toe caps on the toes of his galoshes. The first question he's asked by Lily, the caretaker's daughter, is whether it's still snowing. Okay, granted, it's January. But Gabriel doesn't answer the question while heading for a crackling fire, as we might expect, because for all we're told, there is no fire in the house. We don't know where the light, at least initially, is coming from. Instead, there's Aunt Julia, whose gray hair is drawn over the tops of her ears that frame her gray face. There's an intense discussion of galoshes, and Gabriel's wife is described as being determined to walk home in the snow if she were let. There is joviality. There's Mr. Brown's sidling mimicry. There's Freddie Malon's inebriated arrival and his high-pitched bronchitic laughter at his own humor. But the first clear sense we get of what is lighting this feast day that brings Christmas to a close is well into the story when we're told of a heavy chandelier which irritates Gabriel Conroy's eyes by reflecting off the glittering beeswax on the floor. In other words, the first real occasion we have of light, as opposed to Araby, is of incidental light, reflected light, something that just bounces back. But then the light begins to come on. The chandelier is there again at the start of Gabriel's speech at the party table, as he meets a row of upturned faces of the other guests. And this time he raises his eyes to the chandelier, not to the darkness as in Araby, but to the light. There follows immediately this amazing moment of exteriority and interiority that are fused by imagination, where Gabriel feels the presence of people perhaps standing in the snow on the quay outside, gazing up at the lighted windows and listening to the waltz music. The air was pure there. In the distance lay the park, where the trees were weighted by snow. The Wellington Monument wore a gleaming cap of snow that flashed westward over the white field of 15 acres. Now light begins to infuse the language of the dead, and it's mixed with shadow, but also with the fall of snow, white snow in the darkness. And Mary Jane, the character Mary Jane, says that the newspapers say the snow is general all over Ireland. I love the look of snow, Aunt Julia says, and we feel that Joycean consciousness coming in with the word sadly. I feel that, I love the look of snow, Aunt Julia says, sadly. Snow being general all over Ireland comes after Gabriel's startling recognition of his own wife as he stands in a dark part of the hall gazing up at the staircase. He references Greta first as a woman, a generic woman. And it's only when she's transformed into a monochrome image of herself and the description of her terracotta and salmon pink panels of the skirt she's wearing, which the shadow made appear black and white, that he recognizes his own wife. In the gloom of the hall, his first impulse is to transform his recognized wife into a symbol and then into a painting. But Greta, the woman who would walk home in the snow if she were let, doesn't allow such reductionism. Even the rich bronze of her hair lit up in the flame of the gaslight, which Gabriel had seen drying in the fire a few days before, and now we get these images of warmth and of light, cannot define her, much as it provokes a rejuvenated erotic desire for her in Gabriel. So the party ends and everybody's leaving. It's very late. The morning is coming on. It's still dark with dull yellow light brooding over houses in the river, with the sky seeming to descend, and the moments of Gabriel and Greta's secret life bursting like stars. And then comes Greta's revelation of her love her doomed love for the dying boy, Michael Fury, which forces Gabriel to stare not upward into the empty darkness in Araby, but into himself, to confront in that morning light, in perhaps both senses of that word, his humiliation at his mangled misunderstanding of Michael Furey's death, his petty jealousies, his piousness and his pompousness. And he goes much further, actually, than the boy in Araby in excoriating himself as a ludicrous figure, a penny boy for his aunts, with clownish lust, a pitiable, fatuous fellow. He actually makes use of shadow by turning his back to the light so Greta cannot see the shame of his forehead. And in that gesture, he realizes that a man died for her, that is Greta's sake. And he begins the process of catching himself out and changing, not changing because another has caught him out, in the words of the priest and homilist in St. Teresa's. With his eyes full of tearful remorse that is a prelude to redemption and reconciliation, Gabriel does not, unlike the character in Araby, swallow the light. He watches the snow, general all over Ireland, fall out of the darkness, silver and dark, obliquely against the light. He knows the snow dissolving our certainties of the world falls out of the dark onto Michael Furey's churchyard, onto its crooked crosses and headstones, on the barren thorns, and finally on all the living and the dead, leaving us not in the half-life of eyes looking up into the darkness burning with anguish and anger, but in the fullness of life that signals its physical, spiritual, and above all, created completion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was really poignant. Like what touches you touches us. For those that are connecting at this point, we get into the last presentation of the academic panel of Bloomsday Montreal 2020, which is being held online. And now we move to our last but not least very special guest. It's Professor John McCourt, who teaches at the University of Macerata. He's joining us from Trieste, no less, where he's the co-director of the Joyce School. He has written a lot of books, but I'm gonna mention the last ones. Writing the Frontier, Anthony Trollope Between Britain and Ireland. He wrote Years of Bloom, Joyce in Trieste, and he has edited many volumes as Roll Away the Real World, James Joyce and Cinema, and James Joyce in Context. He's currently working on a study of the reception of Joyce's Ulysses in Ireland as the centenary of his publication approaches. And today he's gonna talk to us about Joyce and landscape. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Good. Is the sound okay, everybody?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. So I've taken the title pretty literally, and I saw the word landscape, so I thought I would focus on that theme. I'd just like to thank the other speakers. I found all three presentations fascinating. Marcello's on translation as a way of reading, and I'm just completing a book in Italian, a guide to Ulysses in Italian, which meant I had to grapple with Ulysses in Italian. And I learned so much by seeing it translated and puzzling out the translation conundrums of the book. I also really enjoyed Kayla's talk on Aeolus. I think she opened up that chapter very well. And then finally, Peter's very moving discussion, particularly there at the end of the dead and coming into the light. So maybe I will take us slightly out of the light into the shadows. When we think of the term landscape, we think of all the visible features of an area of land, often considered in terms of their aesthetic appeal. We tend to think of the rural, the empty, the uncontaminated, the pastoral, that place in which we celebrate nature and timelessness. So landscape is something usually to be appreciated in solitude. We think of Wordsworth's Lake District or Yeats's Sligo, or Patrick Kavanagh's Inniskeane and County Monaghan. But with Joyce, it is different. He doesn't do landscape in that sense. He doesn't do rural in that sense. He doesn't seem to focus too much on the natural world, and he certainly doesn't do, except very occasionally, timelessness. Time and change are always inscribed into his landscapes. That said, sometimes the word he conjures up in Finnegan's Wake seems apt, and the word I have in mind is a play on landscape, which becomes land-escape, landescape. And it seems a bit relevant to me today because it was by escaping the land and the landscape of Ireland, that Joyce would come to terms with that same Ireland from what he also calls in Finnegan's Wake, the safe side of distance. So I'm thinking here a little bit about Joyce and Joyce as an exile. The Joyce who used his 40-year continental exile in order to find his way to come to terms with his home and with what oppressed the home that he left behind. For Joyce, the act of leaving permitted the act of imaginative recreation of what he left behind. The Irish landscape, in a sense, could only by Joyce be visualized by escape. Joyce's leaving would not be an abandonment of his ongoing engagement with Ireland. Unlike the jealous Sean the Post in Finnegan's Wake, who is compared to St. Brendan heading for the land of promise, or as Joyce puts it, and I quote, the land of breach of promise, with Brendan's mantle, end quote, the Joyce figure, Shem, although he too takes flight, is presented as being patriotic, so serving his country from afar. Not for Shem or Joyce to turn his back on his country as Sean does when he says, quote, "Fick you, I'm through." Shem's flight is connected to the tradition of the wild geese who left Ireland for Ireland's sake in the hope of return, even if Joyce's, like theirs, ultimately turns into a wild goose chase, in the sense in which the phrase was first used by Shakespeare in Romeo and Juliet, to mean a hopeless, if cathartic, quest. And I quote again from Finnegan's Wake, "He winged away on a wild goose chase across the cathartic ocean." So sometimes getting away can be helpful. Joyce's departure, however, condemned him to continued involvement with Ireland. On being asked by Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington why he never returned to Ireland, Joyce famously is said to have replied, "Have I ever left it?" Did he ever leave Ireland? Or did he ever truly stay in Ireland? Is there not a sense in all of his work, a sense that despite his claims, that the Ireland that he, insists so much upon having recreated in his fiction, that Ireland is, because it is fiction, necessarily imagined, conjured up, and confused. And no matter how much the reader wants to see the real in Joyce, there is no way to roll out the real world in fiction. What we see is always, to borrow from Peter, a simulacrum of the real world. And Joyce has great fun, I think, with that idea. When we think of Joyce's Ireland, we think essentially of the urban space of Dublin, dear dirty Dublin. And mostly we think, however, when we think of landscape in Joyce, we think of mental landscape, of internal landscape, the mapping of a character's interiority in solitude. And perhaps that's the only thing that Joyce and the Joyce figure in Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus, might share with the Romantics, the solitude. We think of Stephen in a portrait, stirred by the sight of a young girl on Dollymount Strand. And let me just read the passage. "He climbed to the crest of the sand hill and gazed about him. Evening had fallen. A rim of the young moon cleft the pale waste of skyline, the rim of a silver hoop embedded in grey sand, and the tide was flowing in fast to the land with a low whisper of her waves, islanding a few last figures in distant pools." Now, beautiful, evocative though this is, And despite the ways in which it appeals to the various senses, in a sense, this could be anywhere. There is nothing specific there that says Dollymount or Dublin or Clontarf or the North City. And of course, what we are getting is the landscape being mapped or channeled, or funneled through a character's sense experience, and then through their thoughts. It is, to use Joyce's word here, the landscape is subjected to a process of islanding. The landscape of Sandymount Strand as experienced by Stephen is a perfect example of this. What he sees and hears and what he makes of that, how he makes them relevant to his thought processes. Looking and hearing while meditating philosophically on how that happens with the reader. The reader, as Stephen gets lost in his thoughts, the reader has to take his eye away from the landscape, away from the big picture, and focus with Stephen on the rusty boot on the beach. And the reader is somehow left wondering where the magnificent Strand has gone. And let me read the famous passage, because we are, after all, celebrating Bloomsday here in and with the Joyce readers of Montreal and elsewhere. Ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that, if no more, thought through my eyes, signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver, rust coloured signs. And I'll stop it there, but if we want Joyce to evoke the landscape in the way the casual walker or the casual visitor to Dublin might imagine or remember Sandymount Strand, or the way a photographer might want to capture it for Board Fáilte Ireland for the tourist board, well then Joyce isn't much use. Snot green, blue silver, rust coloured signs are probably not going to entice too many to come and explore this landscape. But what is extraordinary is the way that Joyce filters this landscape and this world through Stephen's thoughts, through his senses. Stephen, we read, closed his eyes to hear his boots crush crackling wrack and shells. You are walking through it howsoever, I am a stride at a time, a very short space of time through very short times of space. And on it goes. But the remarkable sense experience and visual experience, time and space, in harmony, if you like, with each other, as this is filtered through Stephen's thoughts. Like so many of the scenes of Ulysses, the Proteus walk would have been difficult to achieve over the last few months in COVID-19 locked down Dublin. Sandymount Strand became one of the principal spots people headed to for their daily walks. Stephen, quite literally, wouldn't have been able to hear himself think on Sandymount Strand in the last couple of months. Now, Joyce made much of the authenticity of his city landscapes, especially the Dublin ones. And of course, he famously declared that if Dublin one day suddenly disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed out of my book, Ulysses. But I think we do well to challenge that comment. Could it really be reconstructed out of Joyce's book? Perhaps the atmosphere can be reconstructed, but the details of the urban landscape, perhaps not. Because we really, although we have maps across Dublin, I'm not sure we have too much sense of the streets and what they looked like 100 years ago. It was almost as if Joyce knew that we, the readers and the critics, would do the contextual work and put together the photo galleries of Joyce's Dublin. We would make, if you like, his fiction become real. We would reenact his fiction, and no more so than on the 16th of June, on Bloomsday. And yet at times, Joyce does indeed focus on the busy cityscape and conjures up worlds, sometimes just through single words. He never fails to write the unexpected, except in Eumaeus, where all he writes is the expected and the cliched, but he does that for unexpected ends. Now, in the Aeolus chapter, which we've already been hearing about today, we meet both Bloom and Stephen, and it opens with the figure of Nelson's Pillar, one of the great landmarks of Dublin, a Doric column of 120 feet of granite, which had been erected in 1808 to commemorate the British naval victory at Trafalgar. Now, a lesser writer might have made some mention to this in some direct way, but never Joyce. It is immediately made clear in Aeolus that the importance attached to this monument is not its commemorative function, but rather its position as a central point in Dublin's mass transport system. In other words, Joyce destabilizes our standard ways of seeing and of reading the city streets. But perhaps he also brings us closer to the way those who live those streets live those streets. In other words, we're not in Dublin as visitors, but as Dubliners or honorary Dubliners. Before Nelson's Pillar, trams slowed, shunted, changed trolley, started for Blackrock, Kingston and Dalkey, Clonskee, Rathgar and Terranure, Palmerston Park and Upper Rathmines, Sandymount Green, Rathmines, Ringsend and Sandymount Tower, Harold's Cross. That's what we hear when we see Nelson's Pillar. Joyce reduces the function of the pillar to that of a tram stop, or a place from which to drop plum stones. There is never a neutral description of landscape, and Joyce always makes us look at things anew. In that scene, in that chapter, two elderly spinsters have saved their money, we're told, to see the views of Dublin from the top of Nelson's Pillar. After preparations, they were told waddle slowly up the winding staircase. Nice nod to Joyce there, to Yeats there, with much effort and with much effort. On reaching the top, we're told they see the roofs and argue about the different churches. Which churches are they? Rathmines, Blue Dome, Adam and Eve, St. Lawrence O'Toole's, but it makes them giddy to look. Instead, the two older ladies sit down under the statue of Lord Nelson while eating their plums and, we're told, spitting the plum stones slowly out between the railings. So in one way, this is a very authentic version of Dublin, and it couldn't really have happened anywhere else, because Dublin is not interchangeable with anywhere else, unlike, for example, Joyce's Paris or his Trieste. Consider this from Proteus. Paris rawly waking, crude sunlight on her lemon streets, moist pith of farls of bread, the frog-green wormwood, her matin incense, court the air. Bell'uomo rises from the bed of his wife's lover's wife. The kerchiefed housewife is astir, a saucer of acetic acid in her hands. And you might say, there's Paris, until you went back to see where it first appeared in Joyce's writing. And we find he dug it out of the text that became Giacomo Joyce, and which was set in Trieste. And it reads here as follows. Trieste is waking rawly. Raw sunlight over its huddled brown-tiled roofs, testudiform, a multitude of prostate bugs await a national deliverance. Bell'uomo rises from the bed of his wife's lover's wife. The busy housewife is astir, slow-eyed, a saucer of acetic acid in her hand. And so we might say here is Joyce regurgitating something that he wrote in Trieste, about Trieste, and making it now fit, if you like, Paris. But it turns out that the first version of this, which I'm not going to read to you, started out as a vignette in one of Joyce's earlier epiphanies. So we have Paris becomes Trieste, becomes Paris. And in one way, all of his continental cities weave into one another in Joyce's hand. And he makes no real effort to create anything like a realistic version of Paris in Ulysses. So Joyce's cities then run into each other and inform each other, even if Dublin is always his principal focus. He says, for myself, I always write about Dublin, because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities in the world. In the particular is contained the universal. He said that He's recorded as saying that by his friend Arthur Power. But I would say that is true, but it was a continentalized Dublin that Joyce created, with Trieste always lurking in the shadows. Now, part of the attraction of the Dublin of Joyce's Ulysses is that so many readers reading all over the world can feel at home in Joyce's Dublin, can see their own cities in Joyce's Dublin, can recognize it as familiar, although of course it is not. Dublin is always doubling. To borrow from Descherteau's idea about space is a practiced place, we might say that Joyce transforms the place of Dublin 1904 into a space in which his characters are in motion, in which the readers can enjoy the illusion of feeling at home in his city. But Dublin itself in Joyce's Ulysses is also a place in motion, never frozen in time. It is as if Joyce isn't interested in places for their own sake, but for what they can say to the individual, or for what he can see about his characters through challenging his descriptions of them through their consciousness of space and place. And I'm coming towards the end. Thus, the Sandymount Strand is entirely different through the eyes of Stephen Dedalus and Gertie MacDowell and Leopold Bloom. And the descriptions ultimately are more about telling us about Gertie or Stephen or Bloom, this is obvious, than they are about the Strand itself. And I think this is true also of how he creates in that final wonderful chapter, Penelope, Molly Bloom's recollections of Gibraltar. And while we could stress the unreality of her recollection, that it is a mirage, that it is a simulacrum, we can also say that all of Joyce's descriptions of landscape and of place, and even of Dublin, are mirages and simulacrum, because in a sense they are the essence of what it is that Joyce does. He writes fiction, no matter how much we want to reimpose fact back upon that fiction. And so I'm just going to finish by reading briefly Molly Bloom's description of Gibraltar, just a couple of lines. And the wine shops, half open at night, and the castanets, and the night we missed the boat at Algeciras, the watchman going about serene with his lamp, and oh, that awful deep down torrent, oh, and the sea crimson sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunset, and the fig trees in the Alameda Gardens, yes, and all the queer little streets, and the pink and blue and yellow houses, and the rose gardens, and the jessamine, and the geraniums, and cactuses, and Gibraltar as a girl, where I was a flower of the mountain. And I'm going to leave you with that image of me as the flower of the mountain. And thank you. And hopefully there'll be some questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you, John. And now we're passing to the party of questions for the panelists. So we're gonna ask the questions as they came in the order of the presentations. Marcelo's been working really hard. He had a lot of questions that he already asked in writing on the section, but there are still questions there. So the first questions is for Marcelo, are for Marcelo. How did you resolve the conflict of literal translation and meaning in the Ulysses?
Haven't you got any easier questions to reply?
Yeah.
But no, I will try to summarize a few words. Meanings and Ulysses. Well, that compared to Finnegan's Wake, it's fairly simple. There are things that you cannot, of course, many things you cannot put into Spanish. It doesn't matter where from you are translating. But in Ulysses, I try to follow. I will use just a simple example, not to make a mess out of these. But but in the text, I said first that comparison of Bloom with the characters of the particularities or similarities between the women or a single woman with the moon. I think he was thinking about Molly. So he used the word propinquity, which means proximity. And I was arguing with the editor, with Edgardo Russo, because he said, Marcelo, we cannot use propinquity. It's a word that I've never used in my life. And one of my answers was, did you ever read a book like Ulysses before? No. Is there any book similar to Ulysses? No. Do you think that Joyce hadn't got in mind other words than propinquity? Well, he could have used proximity. And I said, why do you think he chose propinquity instead of proximity? I said, I don't know. And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, then let's follow the master. He wrote propinquity. We've got a similar word in Spanish, even though we don't use it. He said that the readers will need to go to the dictionary to find the word, and that would pose a delay, a difficulty to the book. And I said, your readers, Joyce's readers, will need to go to the dictionary every now and then if they are reading, if they are interested readers, if they are as Joyce is required, that lector insomne, the reader who don't sleep. So finally, after a hard discussion, my editor, Edgardo Russo, accepted the use of propinquity. I don't know if that answers the question about meanings and how did I deal with those many difficulties, but that could be a partial answer. It means I followed as far as I could the difficulties of the book without trying to smooth it. I didn't try to make it easier for the reader. When it was possible to use something I would say something that a person could go through with the help of a dictionary, I would keep the word. If it exists in Spanish, I would keep the complex word, the complex construction of a sentence. I wouldn't make it easier because I would have been changing the difficulty that James Joyce wanted to write. That's part of my answer, Geraldine.
Okay, next question would be about the strange experiences you had while translating the Ulysses that Marcelo wrote in an unpublished book. It's called Tiempos Violentos in Spanish, Violent Times, while in a story that is called the Rebellious Story. And he already talked about two of those strange things, that one of them took him to the hospital, but it's a third one, that it was a meeting at Sweeney's.
Yeah, as I told you, I used to go around the world to the countries that play rugby with rugby teams. And in the spare times I have, could be in Auckland, could be in England, could be in Dublin, I go to bookshops, of course, to try to find something I could read. And mostly when I was in my work of translating, I was desperate. If I get to London, I wanted to go to bookshops to find something about the works or the method of translating, and did the same in Dublin. Last time I went to Sweeney's. I went to Sweeney's for the first time with I sent them a book, one of these books, the original Ulysses. A friend of mine took a copy to Sweeney. And the second time I went myself with a red book with Finnegan's Wake. I went there to present a book, to give them for the exhibition. You know, they have all the translations of Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. They are on exhibition there. They are not for sale, but they are exhibited there in the shelves of the former pharmacy. So I went there. It was a couple of years ago. I went there without any previous meeting. I just popped in, and they were reading Finnegan's Wake. There was a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, there were 10 or 12 persons there reading Finnegan's Wake. So I popped in and I listened, and they welcomed me and said, "How are you, sir? You want to join us?" And I said, "Yes, of course. I brought here a book that I recently translated. What book is it?" And I said, "It's this red one. It's Finnegan's Wake. It's the first Spanish translation." So they were very pleased that I appeared in such a well-timed moment. And they invited me to briefly explain what the hell I was on. And so I spoke to them, and they wanted to read, to listen to one particular paragraph that they were reading. They wanted to hear how did it sound in Spanish. So I read, say, 10 lines of I don't remember what page. In that moment, when I was reading that, another person popped in, entered the Sweeney's shop, and when I finished reading and the reader was over, he came to me and he introduced himself as an Argentinian person who just happened to pass and saw that there were some books there, Joycean books, and he wanted to know what was that and what was the gathering there for, the meeting for. And he said, "Yeah, I know that you are an Argentinian man, and they told me that you translated Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Nice to meet you." He was an Argentinian man. And he said, "Well, actually, I came here because my daughter, she's doing some course here in the library, it was a library close to this shop." He said, my daughter came here, his professor, his teacher is a Joycean, and that's why I thought that I would bring her to present a book about the Spanish translation of Ulysses. And the book he was carrying, he was bringing from Argentina, the name was The Spanish Translator of Ulysses, which was not me, but the first translator of Ulysses, was a man called José Salas Subirach, the first translator of Ulysses into Spanish. So it was a book written by a person about the translator of Ulysses. And this man, Daniel das Ayras, he was carrying that book, and he popped into the shop where I was giving a short presentation of Finnegan's Wake. And the queer thing is that in that book that he was carrying as a gift for the teacher of the daughter, there were references to the recent translation of Ulysses into Spanish done by Mr. Marcelo Zavaloy, which is incredible. This man was meeting me in Sweeney, carrying a book, the book speaking about the translator of Ulysses into Spanish, and in that book there were several mentions of the recent translation of Marcelo Zavaloy. And I was astonished. I couldn't believe that. If you wanted to make it happen, you could never have done that. So it was this man, it was myself reading passages of Finnegan's Wake. We were in Sweeney's where both books I've translated were there on exhibition, and this man coming in from Argentina, not knowing where the hell he was going, just seeing some Joycean things on the front, and that's it. It's one of the queer things that happened, and that's why I wrote that short story, which I wrote it without using, and that's the thing I wanted to tell you. I am deeply involved in a rewriting of Ulysses without using the letter A, the vowel A. Ulysses without an A. And that's what I am working in for the last not couple of months. I started in December, and I am now sailing through Sirens. So I hope, if I have time enough, to finish it by the end of this year, a version of Ulysses without the letter A. That's all, Geraldine.
Yeah, I have a last question of my own.
Yes.
The previous translation of the Ulysses, they just tried to be really true to the original text, so that made them like impossible to read. It was boring. That's why I actually finished reading the original, and then I was like, okay, I can read this thing. Okay, but this thing is fun. And I noticed that your translation has this this comic side, this ironic tone, because that's what attracts me from your translations, is that you set the tone of Joyce that I didn't see that in the previous translations. Did you think about this consciously, or it just happened by itself?
You mean in Ulysses?
Yeah.
Well, it's very difficult for me, even though I am. My face is not exactly a smiling face, but that's the fault of my mother. She gave me that, so I cannot change it. But apart from the appearances, which is, I agree that it could be horrible and terrifying, it's very hard for me to speak seriously. And I enjoy every single thing that's said as a joke with a very serious face. So I think that Mr. Joyce was something. When he was writing, he could have never been serious in writing neither Ulysses and not to speak about Phineas Wade. So that's why I tried. I don't know if I really was successful in that, but I tried to get the humorous part of it. I think he was writing the book with the tongue in your cheek, as you say, trying to make a joke out of every single tragedy or whatever serious thing might be. There's nothing serious in Ulysses that I can see. I mean, the book is not a joke. Mr. Joyce was not a clown, of course, but I think it was an excellent sense of humor, and I tried to get that. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you.
It was really interesting. So sorry, my phone just checked. So we're gonna move to Kayla. The first question is, how does Joyce's critique on journalism play out in our experience of the media today?
Yeah, let me think about that. So when I was writing, I wasn't necessarily thinking of a present day interpretation. But then during if any of you were present during the introduction to the Bloomsday conference by Dr. Keneally, I was trying to think about, well, how like the journalism aspect would affect or be relevant to, COVID now, this time. And well, we did see a lot of, at first, a lot of newsfeed on COVID, a lot of sometimes inaccurate information that created a lot of panic, I would say. I'm not an expert in journalism by any means, but I would think that it's important now still to be a bit critical when reading newspaper articles or be critical, especially of titles, so those headlines that try to, frame the article, but also grab your attention.
Okay, we have a second question for you. What is the connection between Joyce's and Johnson's perspective on journalism?
So, as I said, this essay was, I wrote an essay on Aeolus in 2016 for a course on Ulysses, and so I was rereading that in the context of this conference, and it's how horrible it could be sometimes to reread your work, especially when it's been 4 years. So anyways, I didn't like it, so I reread the chapter, and in light of a course I had just taken on romanticism and pace, like slow time, fast time, I couldn't help but notice similarities between Joyce's stance, or what the tone suggests is a critique on journalism in Aeolus, and certain romantic era sentiments regarding journalism. So a lot of that was this fear of this new technology, of a fear of some sort of distant degeneration of literature and intellect, in that anyone can be an author and anyone can publish, and I guess that's an old example in the case of Johnson. But even in 1870s England, after official education is installed, or education systems come to be, and journalism begins to have its own niche audience that isn't necessarily the educated white male, I guess, there seems to be a distance between what journalism aims to do and what literature does instead. And so I thought that was an interesting contrast and similarity to explore in Joyce's work.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Kayla, I don't know how to pronounce it well. So I want to move now to the questions for Peter. The first question is, what is the relationship between the young boy in Araby and Gabriel Conroy on the Dead?
As I said, I think you have to be really careful about, saying that the young boy and the young character in Araby becomes Gabriel Conroy or anything like that. Like I don't think that's how stories work, and I don't think that's how, certainly it seems to me how Joyce would have worked. But I think that I think it's fair enough to say that the character in Araby is a kind of stultified or stalled or stopped version of that transformation that Gabriel undergoes, that movement to the interior life, and that recognition of the need for remorse and the need for repentance and the need to make the decision, as he does in that final beautiful passage, to begin his journey westward. I would not go so far as to say that the voice that actually tells us the story of Araby is a version of Gabriel Conroy, but I think if anything, they're sort of mirror images of each other. And I do think that it's really important to put that emphasis on remembering that the story we're being told in Araby is the story of a man probably very equivalent to Gabriel Conroy, looking back at his life and at his youth, and not giving us any sense, at least within the parameters of the story, that he has absorbed and grown and developed himself beyond a point, because he still expresses it with such intensity and such sort of frisson and such rancor towards himself at that age. There's no indication that he's gained any sort of understanding out of that experience.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We have a second question. Can you talk about the idea of blindness in both stories? Is this a moral blindness, an existential epiphany?
Yeah, I think in Arabic it is. I guess it's the blindness of naivety and of being overwhelmed by the sensory experience of becoming, you know, emerging into adolescence. In the dead, it is a function of those characters living in an existence where until that epiphany happens for Gabriel and ultimately I would assume for Greta of coming face to face with what death that a man died for her, as the saying goes, the expression goes in the story. There's nothing to break them out of that. There's these kind of pro forma rituals that they go through, as Gabriel says of himself, a penny boy for his aunts. Freddie Mallon shows up ritually drunk at the party. The sisters sing their songs. Mr. Brown makes his jokes, and there's just this kind of ritualistic aspect, which is a form of blindness because they don't, Gabriel himself acknowledges he can't see until that process of opening both inwardly and then ultimately outwardly begins. He can't see what the fullness of life, what life fully realized actually is. And one of the things that struck me, there's a book from 2010 by the cultural critic and English scholar Terry Eagleton called On Evil. And Eagleton asks a really interesting question, and I don't think we need to go into you know, parsing whether either Araby or the dead are meditations on evil as evil, but Eagleton asked the question, what if depthlessness is what the demonic is actually like? Like we think of the demonic, that blindness, as this kind of, you know, great figure striding across the globe. But what if it's actually that shallowness? What if it's actually that inability to live life fully, to recognize that the snow falls on the living and the dead, and that they are in relation to each other. They are a created continuity with each other. That's I think the blindness that is evoked in many ways in both the stories and stops short in Araby, but becomes more fully realized in the dead.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Okay.
We're gonna move to the questions for John McCord. The first question is that John mentioned using the Italian translation of Ulysses by Enrico Terroni, and somebody's asking if he knows other two translations to Italian, the one of Giulio De Angelis and Bonaflecchias, and wanted to know your opinion on these translations, John.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I was saying we're very lucky in Italy that we have, I think, up to 5 translations of Ulysses, several of which have been done in the last couple of years. I mostly used Enrico Terrinoni's, which you see here, which captures, I think, very well something that Marcella was talking about, which is the humor of Ulysses. But I also regularly look at this one, which is the first Italian translation, the Mondadori edition, by Giulio De Angelis, who was helped by Giorgio Melchiori. But that presents a much more classic text, if you like, and I think drains some of the humor out. And it's so hard, I think, to translate the Dublin language of Ulysses, and so much of the humor of Ulysses lies within the ability to render the way people spoke in Dublin. So the Terrinoni is excellent, and as another new one has just been published about 2 weeks ago, called by Mario Bondi, who's a poet, an elderly poet who spent, I think, the best part of 20 years working on this translation, and I haven't read it yet. I haven't looked at it, but I'm told excellent things about it. So in a way, the Italian reader will be spoiled for choice when trying to choose a translation to look at. So yeah, they all have their strengths, let's say.
Okay, we have another interesting question about how did Joyce's experience of Zurich influence Ulysses as he set out to write it?
Not very much at all, I think, which may sound strange. I think when Joyce got to Trieste, he was aged just 22. He was very young, and he already had Stephen Dedalus formed in his mind. And in some way, Leopold Bloom was much more a product of his 15, 16 years with breaks in Trieste. So all of Leopold Bloom's European, Jewish, Hungarian background, most of that seems to me to come from Joyce's time in Trieste. Joyce's time in Zurich was a temporary time, a time of refuge. The city was a haven, and Ulysses was already formed in Joyce's mind. He possibly would have been influenced by some of the artistic movements there at the time, by the Dadists, for example, by his work in theatre when he was there. But I don't think we can see a very strong imprint of Zurich on Ulysses. We might be able to say that Zurich, like Trieste, was a multicultural city with people from all the ends of Europe together, and that possibly is to be heard more in the multilingual kind of choruses of Finnegan's Wake. So I'm afraid I have to slightly probably disappoint in the answer that I'm giving there.
We have in the audience the Catalonian translator of Finnegan's Wake, Marisa Aixas, and she has a question that I also asked myself while you were talking, because you said, yeah, Joyce used to say, like, the Dublin, you can rebuild Dublin from what I'm writing in the Ulysses, but it's not exactly like that, because it's more about the interior landscape. But we have Dublin in the Ulysses and in the Finnegan's Wake. So the landscape, you talk already about the landscape in Ulysses, Dublin or the interior landscape, because you talk about both of them, or they merge. In the case of the Finnegan's Wake, could you talk a little bit about it?
Landscape in Finnegan's Wake. Yeah, I'm very slow to say anything about Finnegan's Wake, because whatever you say can be contradicted quite successfully.
Yeah.
However, I think what happens in Finnegan's Wake, which of course, if we think that Ulysses finishes at Howth Head with Molly, evoking Howth and evoking her time up there with Leopold Bloom, Finnegan's Wake begins again with Howth as central, Howth, city and environs, HCE, the giant who is also, in a way, the head of Howth. So there is a real sense in Finnegan's Wake how character becomes landscape, or landscape becomes character, So if you think about Finnegan himself, he builds a skyscraper, but he also becomes a skyscraper. A whale worth of a skyscape of most Eiffel, Howth in Towerley. So he himself becomes a skyscraper as big as Howth. Or Anna Livia, who is a woman, who is the water, who is a river, but we're blurring the boundaries all the time between landscape and character. So we reading about Anna Livia, we hear by earth and the cloudy, that's how you make a river, earth and cloud, rain that falls on the earth, but I blindly want a brand new bankside. And we're all expecting backside, of course, but it's bankside. So here we have landscape and character merging in Finnegan's Wake. But it's a huge question now, and I think we'd need most of the afternoon to do it any justice. But they're just two thoughts that I would throw out there. Also, when I was listening to the question about Aeolus, if I can butt in, if you like, what would Joyce in Aeolus, what does Joyce say in Aeolus that could be relevant to the media today? I think everything in Joyce is relevant to how we look at the media today. The media as hot air, the media as not trustworthy, the need for every reader, as we were told, as Kayla told us, that we need to read critically. And three words came to mind as I listened to her answer, and I agreed with her answer, was from Finnegan's Wake again: trash, tricks, and trumpery from Finnegan's Wake. And trumpery, I don't need to explain too much, but it's almost as if Joyce had anticipated what was coming. But it's better to read that whole passage from the Ballad of Pierce O'Reilly and maybe to give us some hope. But soon we'll bonfire all his trash, tricks, and trumpery. We'll bonfire them all. And so all I suppose I'm trying to say is that we trust nothing when we read. And that's the only way you can read Joyce himself. You can trust nothing. It's never reliable. It's always fiction in some way. And there's a great lesson in that. Ulysses should be required reading for everyone.
Okay, the next is a cross question for Marcelo and for John. About the use of local jargon to translate Ulysses, because Marcelo, he used a porteño jargon, because you know that Ulysses is mostly it's written in a Dublin's jargon. And then you mentioned, and that's why it hit me, that when you read all these Italian translations, also they use also the local jargon for doing it. And both of you, can you talk a little bit about that? Because what happened before with Ulysses is that previous translators, they were trying to translate it to a general universal Spanish, and they, with all the respect, I think they failed, because then it's like, it's everything and it's nothing. So you just could talk a little bit about it.
May I?
The two of them, yeah.
Okay, just a wee example of it. At the end of, I think it's episode 14. Yeah, Oxen of the Sun, is it? Yes. When that meeting in the hospital with all the scholars and the students and the doctors are drinking, and Bloom is there, and Stephen and his friends, and they are leaving for the bar once more. There are lots of sounds and cries and things about the horse races, and if I don't get it wrong, because I am citing by memory, from memory, there's a name of a famous jockey, and the jockey of cries of bookies who are offering or bidding for some horse or the other. I can't remember exactly the page or the paragraph, but I remember that I had to take the name of a very ancient jockey in Buenos Aires and a very famous cry in the stands there at the races, which was Leguizamo Solo. Leguizamo was the name of these famous jockeys of the 40s and the 50s, and I think he died in the early 70s. But he was very well known to my parents and my grandparents. He was a star. He was a winner. And why use that name instead of using the name of the Dubliner, the jockey that James Joyce put in there? And I said, these days, what person in Dublin would remember the name of that old jockey of probably the 1920s, say, or the 1910s? At the same time, who these days will remember the name of that old jockey in Buenos Aires, who was well known in the 40s or the 30s? So that's jargon. That cry, Leguizamo Solo nomás, was what the people in the stands were shouting when at the horse races, when this jockey was running. So that's a small example, a localization of what's supposed to be a cry or a joke or whatever, put it in the same key as Joyce did it. He put something that was only known for the old Dubliners. And I put something that was only known to the old people in Buenos Aires in Argentina. Why putting the same name in English that wouldn't bring nothing to the Spanish reading or the Argentinian readers? So if somebody remember the name of Leguizamo, reading the book in Spanish, he would understand what was going on. That it was people shouting there, cheering for the favorite horse and jockey, as well as it was something included in the price of that bookie, trying to get bidders to bid on that jockey and to earn some money. That's a sort of explanation which is unclear. As John said, nothing is clear in Ulysses or Phineas Wake. That was my interpretation, and that's why I sorted out that difficulty.
Okay, and John?
Yeah, that's a solution. I mean, there's no right answer.
Yeah.
Would agree on. When Enrico Terinoni was working on his Trieste, his Italian translation, we discussed maybe the Dublin argot, the Dublin language, the Hiberno English, maybe to use an Italian dialect. We thought about Triestino, because that's the one that Joyce knew so well. But he ultimately decided that would have changed the book dramatically, because, it would have just made it an Italian novel. So he went mostly for pretty standard Italian throughout. But yeah, I mean, it's a problem. And people, not only do they not know that jockey that Marcelo was mentioning, but I mean, so many of the catalogs and names in Ulysses are lost to us now. They're really just names. So what is the translator to do with them? Just simply render them as they are. All the priests' names, for example, that are listed in Cyclops, for example, or the list of heroes in Cyclops. What do you do with that? Do you translate them? A lot of the Irish ones would be very far away from the general knowledge, and even a lot of Irish people wouldn't know who they are anymore. So, it's a real problem. Joyce and the ordinary, so-called ordinary reader, so much in the book is extraordinary, and it's so hard to ever be entirely ready, prepared to take it all in. And I'm glad I will never have to translate it.
Okay, I have a question for the four panelists. Why Joyce keeps talking to us today?
Who do you want to start?
Well, we can start like with Kayla and Peter, that they haven't talked for some time. Kayla?
Yeah, I guess something to do. I guess it has something to do with it being a challenge, something that maybe that is a mixture of inaccessible, and personal as well, and that has to do, I get, a little bit with, as was said earlier, that delving into the specific and the universal, I think, has a lot to do with why it's still relevant, or why it's so widely studied to this day.
Okay, the question was, why Joyce still speaking to us today? And now it's Peter's turn.
Peter's turn, great.
I think I actually have two quick answers to that. One, I think because he was such an extraordinary musician. He's such a musical writer. And I think once you start reading Joyce, and again, I go back to, I first read him as someone learning how to write, and he was presented to me as someone to read so that you actually can develop as a writer. You get phrases and I'm going to use the word melodies from Joyce in your like earworms that you can't get out. And so you always want to come back and read the story again, or read that part of Ulysses again, or read parts of Portrait again, or read the whole thing, because you just, it's like a song that you want to sing. And the talk I gave last year was on actually listening to Joyce audibly, through the Audible books, and listening to them on earphones, and listening to the reading on earphones. And I think that's what it is with Joyce. You cannot shake that musical sense. So we all have favorite songs, right? And the minute you hear a particular song, you just want to hear it again. You just you'll listen to it. You'll be there to listen to it again. And I think that's, in its essence, that's what Joyce says to us. The other thing I was thinking of this as John was speaking. I came across a quote from Joyce, which I haven't verified it, but I think it sounds true. That he was asked if he was a Catholic, and he said, well, more Jesuit than Catholic. I'm more of a Jesuit than a Catholic. And to me, that his formation in that Jesuitical sense of absolutely immersing that interior sensibility in the word in the world. And this is what you were talking about, John, in terms of landscape, of embedding yourself in landscape. You can't, once you start reading Joyce, you're just drawn into the landscape. You're not reading text anymore. You're reading the world in the way that the Ignatian spirituality trains to read the Gospels as if you are actually in the scene, the Gospel passage that you're reading. And I think that those two things combined together they're certainly what makes me constantly go back to Joyce, and I think they're ultimately a critical part of his power.
If I could just add one little thing, I think, as you said, a form of immersion happens. I think that has a lot to do also with the wealth of maybe intertextual components and all these references that are impossible to pick up on your first read. And I think that's also has to do with that immersion.
Can you answer this general question, John, while Marcelo reconnects?
Sure, of course. I mean, it's a big question, and who knows, the fascination of what's difficult, as Yeats calls it. I was trying to begin to write the guide to Ulysses early in the spring when the COVID-19 crisis hit Italy. And so in a context that was extremely difficult, and I said to myself, what is the sense of doing this when thousands of people literally were dying every day in Italy? And I found it hard to actually keep going, except that it is full of sense, because Ulysses is full of life, because Joyce's writings are full of life. And uniquely to me, they give us that sense that the only certainty we have is uncertainty, unless somebody is lucky enough to have religious belief. And that we live surrounded by death. I mean, the story, The Dead, tells us that. The way death is inscribed in Ulysses as they cross the city in Hades, that it is the city of the living and the dead, the faithful departed or the unfaithful departed. And so I think the message I'm getting from Ulysses today is probably a different one to a year or two ago. I probably would have said I keep reading Ulysses because I just love the humor. But today, I think I'm probably reading it because I find something very affirming in his celebration of very ordinary people, very flawed, unheroic heroes, Stephen, Leopold Bloom and Molly Bloom, who are muddling through and living with uncertainty. And in a way, that is the human condition. And we've been reminded of that pretty dramatically, I think, in the last few months. So that to me is right now why Ulysses is talking to me and why I want to keep engaging with it.
Oh, that was really touching. I feel the same. Okay, we want to finish with Marcelo answering the general question, why Joyce keeps talking to us today.
Well, I was saying, without you hearing, because I was wasn't aware of the microphone being closed. That's the most difficult question you have posed today. And I was trying, while all of you were speaking, I was trying to think in something sensible or intelligent to say, which is very difficult. And mostly if you are using a language that is not your own. And I cannot say something very definite. I can mention that I have read the book. I am now making the revision for the 3rd edition of Ulysses, and that includes rereading in the most scrupulous way you can read a book. Having translated it, I would say this is the 15th or 16th reading from the very beginning, since I started reading. And it's always a new book, and it's not a way of saying, it's not just a resourceful words that I am using. It's, as you all know, it's absolutely true. It's a new book every time you read it, and I cannot explain that. I can only say that looks like a miracle. It's something that you're not supposed to find in any other book. Probably you read a couple of times or 2 or 3 times other books and then you never come back to them. But people who are infected with the Joycean virus will always come back to find something when you cannot sleep, when you want to say something that you cannot find words, and you remember that you read something similar in such and such episode, and you start Googling and go through and run desperate. And all of us, we can say one word and we all know where that word belongs, where it comes from. It had only happened with very few books in my life. There are many books who I cherish and I remember and I keep deep in my bosom, but no other book I keep in my mind as I keep these terrible objects that this man has written. Ulysses, I'm feeling this way. So I cannot say nothing sensible or intelligent, but I can only show that I am still amazed, surprised, and I have no more words to say about Ulysses. It's the most lovely thing I've ever read. Ta-da! That's it.
Ta-da! We're getting to the end of today's event, the academic panel of Bloomsday Montreal 2020. And now I'm gonna leave you the final word. I'm gonna leave the final word to Miles Murphy, who is the person that has worked the hardest for this to happen. You just see my face because I just have a bigger mouth, but he's the person that has been doing all the hard work behind it. So I'm gonna leave the end of this to them. Thank you for being there and for inviting me. This is so exciting. So I'm gonna leave you with Miles now.
So I want to conclude with a final word, and that the word is yes. So, and I want to thank everyone who joined us online today. Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, John McCourt from Trieste, Marcela Zabaloy from Bahia Blanca in Argentina, Kayla Fanning and Peter Stockland from Montreal. It was a fascinating journey today, and I really enjoyed every minute of it. And I want to especially thank our moderator and host, Geraldine Jimenez. I mean, her bubbly excitement and passion for Joyce is obvious. So I want to thank everyone for that. And finally, I want to welcome everyone to the rest of Bloomsday, to join in the festivities, especially tomorrow as we continue with readings. I don't know if Kathleen, are you here?
Yes, I am, Miles. I'm here.
Can you talk about the upcoming events?
Yes, I'd be delighted to talk about the upcoming events. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, we're going to start with readings from the novel. Kevin Wright, our president and always the moderator of the readings, has selected individual sections of individual chapters for individual people to read. We've got our top readers, and one person in particular that many Montrealers will remember is Maurice Podbury, who is confined to South Africa as we speak. He's originally from South Africa, had to get away because of all the reasons that you have to get away from South Africa when your family is very left-wing and involved in politics, so he had to get out of there, and he had a peripatetic life, settled in Montreal, and became the founder and artistic director of our premier professional theater, the Centaur. Now in retirement, he returned to South Africa, and he shares his time between Montreal and South Africa. This year, he can't get back to Montreal because there aren't any flights. So he's there, and he is going to be one of the readers. So that's very exciting. And so that's in the morning. And so there's 6 readers. And in the afternoon, I'm going to be reading, it's always been my privilege to read chapter 18, Molly Bloom's Reverie. Obviously, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it would take 5 hours. But whatever I can read in an hour and a bit, along with a couple of beautiful singers to sing Molly's songs, because you don't want to hear me sing Molly's songs. Geraldine herself will be singing a couple of numbers, and Kathleen McAuliffe, who, if you had a chance to watch our concert, was our singer, one of the singers. So it's going to be really terrific. The 3 of us are going to embody Molly Bloom, because, you know, she's such an incredible character. It takes more than one person to do so. That's going to be at 2 o'clock. So tomorrow, tune in. And if you don't have a chance, or your friends don't have a chance, be sure to tell them that they can catch it on YouTube, either immediately or after Edmund does some technological magic to cut out some fluffs. So thank you very much. It's just been so wonderful today. Thank you to all those incredible panelists. It certainly was a joy to be able to have you present here with us online. We wouldn't have been able to do that if we had been, as I said, in the McKenty Reading Room. But let's see what we do next year. We can maybe do a combo of live and online. It's really been terrific. Thanks again to Geraldine and to Miles for his incredible coordination and grace under pressure. See you tomorrow.